"I understand," she said to me, in my kitchen, with the same steadiness she had used to describe everything else, from the night she left to the desert outside Flagstaff to the slot machine in Atlantic City. "I understand. I left him. I left him and I didn't come back. Not the way he needed me to come back. Not the way a mother should come back. And he's 27 now. He's a lawyer in Boston. He's a good lawyer. He does housing law. He works for a non-profit that keeps people from being displaced from their neighborhoods. He's a person who cares about justice in a way that makes me so proud I could burst. Except I don't have the right to burst because I had so little to do with who he became. Robert raised him. Robert and Diana raised him, with all the advantages and the stability and the proper father figure and the family dinners and the summers at the house in Maine. And he turned out fine. Better than fine. He turned out to be a genuinely good man. And I am so proud of him, Carolyn. I have no right to be proud of him, I know that. I know I gave up that right when I walked out of that nursery. But I am. I am proud of the man Robert raised. And I am sad that I had nothing to do with it. Both of those things are true at the same time, and they tear me apart every single day, and I have learned to live with that tearing because there is nothing else I can do. She was at the nonprofit for 14 months. She was good at it, genuinely good, not performing good, not the way she had been good at charity galas and board meetings and the elaborate social theater of Bridgeport wealth, but actually materially good at helping people. She could talk to the women who came through the program, many of them her age or older, women who had made terrible mistakes and served time and were trying, with trembling hands and shaking voices, to put the pieces of a life back together in a world that had no patience for people who had already been left behind once. She could sit with them in the office at 9 p.m. and hear their stories and not flinch, not judge, not offer unsolicited advice. She could do the work of connecting people to housing and job and legal aid and childcare and all the thousand small necessities that separated the words "I'm starting over" from the reality of actually starting over, which was expensive and exhausting and required a level of institutional navigation that most people with privilege never had to develop. Deborah told her once, during a late night at the office, they were alone, the building was dark, the only light was the desk lamp in Deborah's office and the glow of a space heater in the corner, that Margaret had a gift for seeing people, for really seeing them, not looking but seeing. Deborah said she had watched Margaret with the women in the program and noticed something unusual. Margaret didn't look at people like they were projects or cases or problems to be solved. She looked at them like they were the most important person in the room, like their story was the only story that mattered in that moment. That is rare, Deborah said. That is so rare in this work. Most people come in with savior complexes or guilt or the need to feel good about themselves. You come in like someone who has been in the dark and knows what it looks like. That changes how you see people. That changes whether they trust you. Margaret cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes afterward. She texted me about it that night, my number recovered, rememorized after she realized that Delia from Austin had never deleted it and had been the one to give it to the social worker in Oakland who had given it to someone else who had given it to someone else who eventually tracked me down through a chain of savers and coincidences that Margaret said felt like the universe conspiring to make sure I knew she was alive. She texted me from her studio apartment in Bridgeport at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, and the text was just 4 words, with the windows down, June air flooding the car and the road shining silver under the highway lights. She pulled over onto the shoulder and she put her head on the steering wheel and she sobbed so violently that the car shook. She sobbed for Connor. She sobbed for the life she was abandoning and the person she was becoming and the person she was leaving behind. She sobbed for the woman she would have been if she had stayed, the good wife, the present mother, the society hostess, the heiress who did her duty, who reproduced the dynasty, who smiled in photographs and remembered names and gave to charity and was, by every external measure, a success. She sobbed for that woman because she was about to kill her and she wanted to mourn her properly. And then she sobbed because she did not actually believe the old Margaret was dead. She believed she was just sleeping, and she was terrified that one day she would wake up and she would be that woman again, standing in a doorway, looking at a life she had not chosen and did not know how to live. She sobbed with grief and with terror and with something else, something that felt, even now, even from 25 years away, like relief. Like the first breath after being underwater. Like the moment you admit to yourself that you have been lying, really lying, for years, and the admission of the lie is worse than all the lies combined, and then it passes, and after it passes there is a space where the lying used to be, and the space is terrifying and exhilarating and empty and open, and it is the most honest place you have ever stood. And then she drove. And she didn't stop driving for a very long time. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance? Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. On the 9th day of her stay, Tom came home early from work. He had been worried, he said, about me, about Margaret, about the weight of whatever she was carrying that had landed in our living room like a suitcase full of someone else's grief. And the four of us sat in the living room, Tom and me and Margaret and the bottle of Blanton's single-barrel bourbon Tom had been saving for something he called an occasion and that I had never seen him open. Not for birthdays or promotions or the day our daughter graduated from college, and Margaret told her story again, and Tom listened with the quiet, steady attention of a man who had been married to me long enough to know that my stories were always worth hearing twice, and that the women I loved were always worth the time it took to sit still and receive them. Tom asked her a question I hadn't thought to ask. He said, if you could go back, if you could stand in that nursery again, with Connor in your arms, and you knew everything you know now, would you stay? Margaret considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She swirling the bourbon in her glass, she held it up to the light from the fireplace, our first of the season. The smell of oak and ash filling the house, the warmth of it pushing back against the October cold outside, and she looked at the color of it, the amber, the way the light moves through it and fractured. No, she said. I would not stay. Because the woman who stayed would not have been me. She would have been a version of me that looked like me and sounded like me and went through the motions of my life, but she would have been dead inside. A ghost. A very well-dressed, very well-behaved ghost wearing someone else's skin. And Connor would have known. Children know. They know when their mother is a ghost. May grow up thinking that ghostliness is normal because that's the only model they have. And he would have married someone he didn't love because he watched his mother do exactly that. And he would have spent his life being reasonable and responsible and empty. And he would have blamed her for it without ever having the words to say why. And I would have watched it happen, and I would not have been able to stop it because the ghost would have been too tired to fight. Too tired of pretending. Too tired of being something she wasn't. She pired. Took a sip of bourbon. Set the glass down on the side table with a small, precise sound. But I would have left differently, she said. I would have fought for custody. I would have said goodbye to my son, not in a letter, not in a voicemail, but to his face, when he was old enough to understand, maybe 5 or 6, maybe not even then, maybe it would have been impossible, but I would have tried. I would have promised him, Carolyn, that I would come back, that I would always be his mother, that the leaving was not the same as the abandoning. That there was a difference between leaving a life and leaving a child, and I had conflated the two because I was young and scared and I didn't know how to them. I would have kept that promise. I would have called him on his birthday every single year. I would have shown up, not as the mother who was supposed to be there every day, but as the mother who chose to leave and chose to love him from a distance and chose to let him know that even women who run, even women who burn their lives down, still love their children. I would have done that differently. I would have been braver about the leaving and more consistent about the loving. And I think if I had done that, he might have understood. He might not have forgiven me, and I wouldn't have asked for that, but he might have understood. And understanding might have been enough. She looked at the fire. The logs had settled and there were sparks rising and falling, small brief lives of light. I failed him by leaving, she said. I know that. I failed him in the moment I chose myself over him, and I am not going to pretend that was a noble choice or a heroic one or a sacrifice for my own self-actualization. It was selfish. It was profoundly, irredeemably selfish. And I have lived with that knowledge for 25 years, and I will live with it until I die. But I also failed him by disappearing, by not calling, by letting the silence between us calcify into something that could not be broken without effort, without pain, without risk. Those are two different failures, Carolyn. And they both belong to me. And I have to own both of them. And I have to live with both of them. And I have to try, even now, even at 55, even with $11 and a garbage bag and a room in someone else's house, I have to try to be something my son can eventually understand, if not forgive. Tom reached over and took my hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had heard enough. He had heard a woman tell the truth about the worst thing she had ever done, and he had understood, as Tom always did, with his quiet carpenter's logic, his builder's sense of structural integrity, that the truth was the only thing that could hold. On the 11th day, I drove her to Bridgeport. She wanted to see the old house, the Ashford house on Prospect Street, the one her father had willed to her brother Richard, the one where she had grown up behind tall hedges and leaded windows and a circular driveway that had been paved with money and maintained with the same meticulous care Howard Ashford brought to everything, including his children, who were assets to be managed and legacies to be perpetuated and were never, not once, to be understood as people with wants and needs that diverged from the company plan. The house was still there, of course. It was always going to be there. White Georgian for columns, the flagpole in the front yard that her grandfather had installed in 1852 and that had flown the American flag every day of Margaret's childhood, in sun and rain and snow and the particular gray of Connecticut Novembers. The flag replaced every year on Memorial Day with a fresh one bought at the hardware store like everyone else's, except the Ashford's flagpole was 30 feet tall and the flag was regulation size and it was flown with a precision that bordered on the devotional. Richard and his wife had painted it a shade of gray that was supposed to be fashionable. The garden had been redesigned by a landscape architect from Boston, a man who had studied in Vermont and who believed in native plantings and rain gardens and the kind of ecological landscaping that Howard would have found preposterous, aesthetically interesting but practically useless, like art that had no function. The property looked immaculate and cold and like it had never once contained a single messy, shouting, joyful family dinner where someone spilled wine and someone else told an inappropriate joke and someone's mother told them to stop talking with their mouth full. We sat in the car across the street. Margaret didn't get out. She didn't take a photo. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at it, at the house that had raised her, and the flagpole that had watched her leave, and the hedges that had kept the world out and kept her in, and the circular driveway where she had learned to ride a bicycle and where her father had once, just once, thrown her a football and caught it badly and laughed, actually laughed, Howard Ashford, a laugh she had replayed in her memory 1,000 times because it was so rare and therefore so precious. My mother died in that house, she said, quietly. In the room at the top of the stairs, the one with the bad draft. She was 68. The doctor said her heart just stopped. No warning, no final illness, just a heart that had been pumping faithfully for 68 years and had simply decided it was done. But I think her heart stopped years before that. I think it stopped the morning she realized that no one in that house saw her. Not my father, who was at the office from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. and brought work home on weekends. Not me, who was at college and then traveling and then married and then gone. Not Richard, who was at boarding school and then at Yale and then at the company and then married to Caroline in a ceremony that my father said was the happiest day of his life since the day the company went public. My mother was the most beautiful woman in every room she ever walked into, and she was completely, devastatingly alone. And she died alone. And I was in California when it happened, chasing something I couldn't name, and I got on a plane and I flew home for the funeral, and I stood at the graveside and I cried. And I think the tears were for her and for me and for all the conversations we never had because we were both too polite, too well brought up, too afraid of saying something real to ever say it. She turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I'm not going to pay Robert $42,000, she said. "I don't have it, and I won't borrow it, and I won't beg for it. And I won't pretend that his offer is reasonable or that his conditions are fair, because they're not. They're the conditions of a man who is wounded and who has spent 25 years building that wound into a fortress, and I understand the fortress. I built one of my own, but I will not pay to enter a family I was born into. That's not love. That's transaction. And I spent enough of my life in transactions. I married into one. I left one to escape it. And I will not go back to a version of it where my presence has a price tag." She put her hand on my arm. Her fingers were thin and strong, and there was a scar on her thumb from the pottery wheel in Santa Fe, from the life she had lived, from the woman she had become, which was someone who made things with her hands and left them behind. "Drive me back to your house," she said. "I need to borrow a shower and a clean shirt, and I need to call Robert one more time and tell him to go to hell. Politely. With love. But go to hell. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance." Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. She made the call from my kitchen. She stood at the counter with the phone pressed to her ear and the late October sun coming through the window above the sink, the same window I looked through every morning to check the weather, to see if the hydrangeas needed water, to watch the neighborhood come to life in its small, ordinary, precious way, and she said, "Robert, it's Margaret. I want you to know that I love you. Not the way a wife loves a husband. Not the way I was supposed to love you on our wedding day when I stood at the altar and said words I meant but didn't understand. But the way one human being loves another human being who shapes them, who was part of their story, who gave them something even when it wasn't the right thing. I love you. And I love Connor. And I will love you both from wherever I am for the rest of my life. And I will not pay you $42,000 to do it. Not because I don't value what you've built. I do value it. I value it more than I can tell you, because you built something real while I was busy chasing something I couldn't define. But I won't pay. Because paying would mean that the love is conditional on the money, and it's not. It's not conditional. It's there. It's been there for 30 years. It's been a terrible, imperfect, insufficient love, but it has never stopped. And I won't let a number in a bank account make it look like something it isn't." She paused. Listened. I could see Robert's voice on the other end, not what he was saying but what it was doing to Margaret's faith, the way her expression shifted through registers of emotions so fast I could barely track them, like watching someone read a book and react to every plot turn in real time. No, I will not pay you $42,000. I don't have $42,000. And I won't pay to be loved, Robert. That's not love. That's transaction. And I spent enough of my life in transactions. And you know that. You know that more than anyone. We were a transaction from the beginning, your money and my family's connections, your stability and my family's legacy, your good name and my good face. We were a merger, Robert. We were a merger that should never have been structured because the due diligence was never done. The people doing the deal didn't understand what they were acquiring. And I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. And we both paid for it. And we're both still paying. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the part of it that was my fault. And I know the part that was yours, and I know you're sorry too, even if you can't say it, because you built a life after me that was better than the life you had with me, and that tells me you learned something. And I hope the learning wasn't too expensive. Another pause. Longer. Margaret's eyes closed. Tell Diana I said hello. Tell Connor I said, tell Connor his mother is okay. Tell him that. Tell him she is okay. Tell him she's still figuring it out, but she's okay. And tell yourself whatever you need to tell yourself to be able to sleep at night, Robert. You were a good man in a bad marriage and you did the best you could, and so did I, and sometimes bests aren't good enough, and that's just the way it is. That's just the way life is. She hung up. She stood there for a moment, holding the phone, looking at the wall. Then she put it down on the counter, carefully, like it was something fragile and important, something she would need again but not right now. She turned to me. She was crying. Not the performative tears of someone who wanted to be seen crying, not the dramatic tears of a woman in a film processing a life-changing moment, but the real tears of someone who had finally let something out that had been stored too long in a place too deep, like a cellar that had flooded and the water had been sitting there for 25 years, and finally someone opened the door and the water came out and it was dark and it smelled like mineral and rust and things that had been dissolved. In it, all the things she had never said, all the words she had swallowed, all the grief she had carried in silence because carrying it silently was easier than letting it be heard. He's not a bad man, she said, through the tears, and she was laughing too, that Margaret laugh, that unhinged, beautiful sound, like a bird that had been caged so long it forgot the shape of flying but remembered the feeling of it. He really isn't. He built walls. He built walls around his life and his money and his family because that's what his father taught him to do, and the walls kept everyone safe, including him, including me, even when I didn't want to be kept safe. He did what he thought was right. He loves the way he knew how to love, carefully, conditionally, with prenuptial agreements and retirement accounts and a will that accounted for every possible contingency except the one where his wife woke up one morning and decided she could not do it anymore. He did what he thought was right. And I did what I thought was right. And we're both paying for it. And that's just the way it is. That's just the way life is. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She laughed again, that wild Margaret laugh, the one that contained equal parts joy and grief and defiance, the laugh I had fallen in love with 28 years ago in a dorm room at NYU when she had walked in on her first day of college with a suitcase that cost more than my parents' car and a smile that said she was going to be the most interesting person I ever met. And she knew it, and she was excited about it and slightly terrified by it and completely determined to be it anyway. Okay, she said. Okay. What now? I wish I could tell you that Margaret found redemption in the way the stories promise, clean, complete, earned. That Connor called her the next week and they reconciled over coffee in Boston, and he wept and she wept, and a family that had been broken for 25 years was quietly, imperfectly, lovingly mended. That Robert sent her a check for $42,000 with a note that said he was wrong, that he was sorry, that he had misunderstood what she was asking, that she was always welcome. That Diana had told him he was being a fool, and Diana was usually right about these things, and he had finally listened to her the way he should have listened to all the women in his life who were trying to tell him something real. Some of that happened. Not all of it. Connor called her 3 weeks later. I know because she called me immediately, breathless, laughing, crying, and said, "Carolyn." He called. He called me. He said he Googled me. Can you imagine? He Googled his own mother, and he found the nonprofit and Deborah and the work I was doing there, and Deborah told him I was someone worth knowing. And he said he doesn't forgive me. He said forgiveness isn't his to give. I asked him what it was then, if it wasn't forgiveness, and he said he didn't know yet. He said he wants to meet me. He wants to have coffee. He wants to look me in the face and see who his mother is. They met. It was not a movie scene. It was 2 people in a coffee shop in Boston. Connor in a suit because he'd come straight from the office, a navy suit, a white shirt, a red tie that Margaret later told me she recognized because she had bought it for Robert for their 5th anniversary, and Robert had apparently kept it and given it to his son, which she said it was the most complicated gift anyone had ever unknowingly received, and they talked for 2 hours, and they did not hug and they did not weep. But they talked. They talked honestly and painfully, and with a kind of raw, ferocious respect that I think was more honest than forgiveness, more real than reconciliation, more useful than closure. Connor asked her why she left. Not why she left Robert, that part he understood, or thought he did, or had made peace with, but why she left him. His specific question was, "Why didn't you take me with you?" And Margaret told him. She told him the truth, not the philosophy, not the soul-searching jazz improvisation, not the 15 years of therapy she had never actually done because she had always believed she could think her way through anything and had only recently begun to understand that some things had to be felt before they could be thought. She told him the simple, brutal, insufficient truth, because I didn't know how to be your mother and be myself at the same time. And I chose wrong. I chose myself instead of you. And I have regretted that every single day since. And I want you to know that it was a choice, not a failure. I didn't fail at loving you, Connor. I failed at staying. Those are different things. And I need you to know the difference, because the difference is the only thing I have left to offer you as an explanation. Connor said he needed time. He said he didn't know what to do with a mother who had left and come back and left again and come back again. He said he would call her. He said he might not call her. He said he wanted her to know that he was not saying goodbye. That there was a difference between goodbye and needing space, and he wasn't sure yet which one he needed, but he was sure he hadn't decided yet. And as long as he hadn't decided, she could call him on his birthday, if she wanted, and he would answer, or at least he would listen to the voicemail. That was enough. Margaret told me that night on the phone, her voice quiet, stripped of every piece of performance she had ever constructed, just a woman talking to her oldest friend about the hardest, most important, most alive she had felt in decades, that it was enough. That being told the truth by the son she had abandoned was the most she could ask for. That she would take his uncertainty over his silence, his questions over his acceptance, his confusion over his closure. Because his confusion means he's still thinking about it, she said. And thinking means there's a door. Even if it's barely open. There's a door. And I can put my hand on it and I can feel that it's there, and I know that at some point, maybe not today, maybe not this year, maybe not for 10 more years, but at some point, that door might open. And I will be on the other side of it, waiting. Not pushing. Just waiting. Because that's what mothers do, Carolyn. That's what I should have been doing all along. And it's not too late. It's not too late. I'm 55 and I have $11 and I live in a room in Bridgeport and my son doesn't forgive me and I'm still, somehow, impossibly, on the side of the door where hope lives. And I'm not giving that up. I refuse. Robert did not send the $42,000. He also did not say go to hell. He said, through a lawyer, because Robert had always processed big emotions through lawyers, because lawyers were to Robert what poetry was to Margaret, a language that made chaos manageable, that the offer was under review. Which meant he was struggling with it. Which meant Margaret's refusal had landed somewhere inside him and was doing the slow, painful work of reconsideration, the same way water does to rock, not dramatic, not fast, but persistent, inevitable, and eventually something gives. Diana called Margaret. This was the thing that no one expected, not me, not Margaret, certainly not Robert, who must have had a small coronary when he found out his second wife had picked up the phone and dialed a number he had never deleted from his contacts. Diana was 61, a retired third-grade teacher, a woman who had been married to Robert for 19 years and had chosen him knowing he had been married before, knowing there was a son, knowing there was a history that would always be there even if it wasn't always present. Diana said she had read about Margaret's work at the nonprofit. Diana said she wanted Margaret to know that she was not the enemy. Diana said she had heard the story from Robert's point of view and she had heard it from Connor's point of view and she thought Margaret's point of view was the one that had been missing and she wanted to hear it. They talked for an hour. At the end, Diana said, I don't think you were wrong to leave. I think you were wrong to leave the way you did. And I think Robert was wrong to ask you to pay. But I don't think either of you were wrong to want something that wasn't what you got. That's not wrong. That's just being human. Margaret called me after that call. She said, Carolyn, Robert married an angel. I don't know how he got so lucky the second time. I used up all his luck the first time. But Diana is extraordinary. And I think Robert might actually be happy. I think Robert might actually, for the first time in his life, be in a marriage that is about something other than what it looks like from the outside. And I should be bitter about that, right? I should be jealous. But I'm not. I'm relieved. Because Robert deserved someone who could love him the way he needed to be loved, and I couldn't do it, and someone else can, and that's good. That's good news. That's the first piece of good news about Robert Sullivan I've had in 25 years. And Margaret went back to Bridgeport. She found a room in a house in the East Side, owned by a 70-year-old Haitian woman named Celie who baked bread every Sunday and played card games with her tenants on Friday nights and who looked at Margaret with the knowing, unsurprised eyes of someone who had seen a lot of women come back from the edge and rebuild, not because they had been forced to but because they had decided that being alive was worth the work of it. Celie charged $500 a month for the room, which was $200 below market rate because Celie said the housing market was criminal and she refused to participate in it at a level she considered exploitative. The room was small, a shared bathroom at the end of the hall, a window that looked out onto a yard with a fig tree that Celie had planted 30 years ago and that produced more figs than anyone on the block could eat. So Celie gave them away in paper bags to everyone who came to her door. Margaret's room had a bed, a desk, a chair, and a bookshelf that Celie had put in after Margaret mentioned she had books. Margaret had 11 books. She had given away or lost or left behind every other book she had owned in 25 years of moving. But she had kept the Chekhov and the Dostoevsky and a volume of Mary Oliver's poems someone had given her in New Orleans, and a cookbook from the community center in Austin, and a journal she had kept for 3 years and filled with handwriting so small and frantic it looked like the text of a treaty being negotiated under duress. Celie put the books on the shelf and stepped back and looked at them and said, "Now it looked like someone lives here." She got a job. Not at a nonprofit. Deborah had sent her a text when the funding was cut to say she was sorry, that she would keep Margaret in mind for any future openings, that Margaret had been the best hire she'd made in 5 years and the worst timing she'd ever had, but at a community center in Bridgeport that ran after-school programs for kids from housing projects. She was the art teacher. She was terrible at it at first. She didn't know how to teach children, how to simplify, how to encourage, how to be patient with the particular chaos of young minds that had not yet learned to filter or edit or perform composure. She would set up a project and half the kids would ignore it and the other half would do something so unexpected she didn't know whether to celebrate or redirect. She cried in the bathroom twice in her first month, not from frustration but from the overwhelming thrillage of being trusted with these small, loud, fearless people who had nothing and showed up anyway and wanted to make something with their hands. But she showed up every day at 3 p.m. and she set up the tables and she handed out the paints, the cheap ones from the discount store, the ones that came in tiny jars and left stains that never fully came out of clothes, and she watched these kids, 8, 9, 10 years old, kids who had nothing, who came from circumstances that would break most adults, who had seen things Margaret had only read about in novels, create things. Just create. Without apology, without expectation, without anyone telling them they were doing it wrong. They painted their houses and their mothers and their dog and their streets and the sun and the moon and things that didn't exist and things that did but shouldn't have, and she looked at every single thing they made and she told them it was good and she meant it. Not because it was technically good, but because it was theirs, because it was the most honest thing they had to offer, because it was an act of faith in a world that had given them no particular reason to believe in it. She called it her church. She said she went to that community center and she watched these children paint and she felt something she had not felt since she was 22 years old, standing in the bookshop on Greenwich Avenue with Daniel, before her father had come along with his careful, reasoned, devastating objections and shown her the door. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she was fixed. Not because she had figured it out. But because she was present, and the presence was enough, and she had finally stopped running long enough to find out what happened when you stayed. She called me every Sunday. We talked for an hour. She told me about the week, the kids, Philly's fig bread, the book she was reading, the letter she had written to Connor that she hadn't decided whether to send, the phone call with Diana that had ended with Diana saying, "I'm glad you exist, Margaret, even if Robert doesn't always feel that way," which Margaret said was the most frightening and wonderful thing anyone had said to her in years. Last month, she told me about a woman who came to the community center, a 26-year-old who had just had a baby and was spiraling, drowning, feeling the same terror in her chest that Margaret had felt in a nursery in a house on Prospect Street 25 years earlier. The woman's name was Amara. She had dropped out of community college. She was living with her mother. She was terrified that she was going to be a terrible mother and terrified that she was going to love her baby too much and terrified that she was going to leave and terrified that she was never going to leave, and she was sitting in the community center kitchen, crying into a paper cup of coffee while Margaret was cleaning up after a watercolor class, and Margaret sat with her for 3 hours after the kids had gone home, after Deborah had locked up, after the building was empty and the lights were dimmed. She didn't tell Amara to stay or to leave. She didn't tell her to keep the baby or to give it up for adoption or to go back to school or to apply for welfare or to leave the man who had gotten her pregnant and wasn't returning her calls. She told her the truth, the whole brutal, beautiful, terrifying truth, that she was not alone, that whatever she chose, she would survive it, and that the choice was hers and it was hers alone and it would be honored. Not by Margaret. Not by the community center. By the universe, which was vast and indifferent and occasionally, against all odds, generous. Amara kept the baby. She named it Margaret. Of course she did, Margaret said, rolling her eyes, but I saw her hand press against her chest, right over her heart, just for a second, and I knew, that the name on that baby's birth certificate was the most meaningful thing that had happened to her since Connor. Last week, Connor called her on her birthday. 56. She was 56 years old and she had been free for half her life and trapped for the other half, and she was sitting in Seeley's kitchen eating fig bread and drinking coffee and reading Mary Oliver when her phone rang, and it was Connor, and he said, "Happy birthday, Mom." He called her Mom. He had not called her Mom since she left. He had said Margaret or my mother or the woman who for 25 years, and now he said Mom and she said, Connor, and they both paused, both of them, the same pause. The pause of two people who have just said a word that changes everything and need a moment to understand what they have done. The call lasted 40 minutes. They talked about his work. He was handling a case involving a community land trust in Roxbury. Something that was trying to keep housing affordable in a neighborhood being colonized by developers who were pricing out longtime residents. Margaret told him it sounded important. He said it was. She told him she was proud of him. He said, and this is the part that made her call me immediately, that made her speak so fast I could barely understand her. That made me pull over to the side of the road in the middle of my errands and sit in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store while my oldest friend told me something that sounded, even secondhand, even reported through her shaking voice, like the thing she had been waiting for since she drove away from a nursery in New Canaan 25 years ago. He said, "I'm glad you said that. Because I wanted to be someone worth being proud of. She is still broke. She is still rebuilding. She has a room in Seeley's house and a job at the community center and a painting on my wall, the one her student made for her, a wild, impossible canvas of blues and oranges that a 9-year-old boy named Deshaun had painted and then given to her with the words, 'This is how the ocean feels when it's happy,' written on the back in crayon, and a son who calls her on her birthday and sometimes on Sundays and has started, tentatively, occasionally, to ask her questions about her life that are not accusations in disguise but are actually questions, genuine ones, from a person who is trying to understand the story of how he came to exist. She has an ex-husband whose walls are slowly coming down, who has started sending her news articles about housing policy and affordable development because he knows she cares about these things and because Diana has told him to find a way to be in her life that is not conditional on her paying him money she doesn't have. She has her health. She has her mind. She has the ferocious, unapologetic, flatly terrifying knowledge that she chose her own life, all of it, the glory and the ruin and the long, strange road back. And that choosing your own life, even badly, even painfully, even at the cost of everything you were supposed to want, is still the bravest thing a person can do. She called me last Tuesday. It was 9 p.m. She was sitting on Seeley's back porch in Bridgeport, wrapped in a blanket, looking at the stars. There was a fig tree in the yard and the remains of Seeley's Friday night card game, empty cups and a scattering of cards on the picnic table, and the sound of laughter from inside the house where Seeley and her friends were playing a second round. "Carolyn," she said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. "I'm happy," she said. "For the first time in my entire life, I am genuinely, completely, no performance required happy. Not because things are good, things are objectively not good. I have $11 in my pocket in a room in someone else's house, and I teach children how to paint badly, and I eat homemade bread on Sunday, and my son calls me mom, and I am happy. And I want you to know that. Because you sat with me in your kitchen and you listened and you didn't try to fix me, and you were the first person in 25 years to make me feel like a human being instead of a cautionary tale. And I will never forget that. I will never forget you. I sat in my own kitchen, on my own phone, in my own life, my 30-year marriage to Tom, and my mortgage, and my Tuesday book club where we had just finished a novel about a woman who leaves her family and moves to Paris, in my quiet, ordinary, extraordinary existence that suddenly felt less like a costume I hadn't removed and more like something I had chosen, really chosen, the way Margaret had chosen her chaos. And I listened to my oldest friend tell me she was happy, and I thought, this is the story. Not the one I was told at the bus station. Not the one the title promised, with its exclamation point. It's refreshing, liberating, a word that in Chinese contains multitudes. The feeling of breaking a fever and stepping outside and breathing clean air for the first time in months. Not a story about freedom winning or family winning or money winning or love winning. A story about a woman who lost everything and kept going. Who burned it all down and walked into the fire and came out the other side with nothing but herself and something that looked, from where I was standing, from across my own kitchen counter, from inside my own ordinary, chosen life, something that looked almost like grace. Maybe that's what freedom really is. Not the absence of consequence. Not the absence of loss. Not the absence of the long, terrible reckoning with every choice you ever made. But the presence, stubborn, defiant, improbable presence, of something in your chest that refuses to be extinguished. Something that says, I am still here. I chose this. I am still choosing. And I am not done. Maybe that's what Margaret was trying to tell me all along. From the dorm room at NYU to the nursery in New Canaan to the bus station in Hartford to Seeley's back porch in Bridgeport. Maybe that's what the whole story was about. The one she told me over 11 days in my kitchen while the October light came through the window and the coffee went cold and Tom came home and the fire burned down and the world kept turning and somehow, against all odds, kept turning towards something that looked, if you squinted, if you were generous, if you believed in the way Margaret believed, like hope. She left at 30. She burned through millions. She came back at 55 with nothing. But the fire in her never went out. Love quiet, forbidden midlife romance. Subscribe to Noah's Awakening for more slow burn stories. The end.